reaching the age of either of the wit. When did you start being interested in politics?
Well, I was employed at the end of the war in an explosives factory at Penrhyn Deudraeth in North Wales. And the owner of the factory was very much an old-fashioned 19th century capitalist, and I crossed him for some reason or other by talking about politics, and he sacked me. But because it was war and I was in a reserved occupation, he had to take me back, and that fired my interest against the so-called capitalist class. I was very sort of naive at the time, and I began to take interest then in about 1944. There was no Labour Party in the village, or for that matter, I don't think at the time in Merionethshire, even it was the wartime, of course, everything had sort of gone by the board. But the end of the war was coming, you could see that, and I, along with one or two other young fellows, restarted the local branch of the Labour Party in Penrhyn Deudraeth, and in fact managed the campaign in that part of the world, Harlech, Barmouth, Bryn y Festiniog, Penrhyn Deudraeth, that area, in the 1945 election. I was really the secretary of the party in that campaign, very young, very inexperienced, but I enjoyed every minute of it. We had as our candidate Hugh Morris-Jones, later Professor Hugh Morris-Jones, and he lost a seat to a Liberal, Emrys Roberts, by 112 votes. And I felt shattered that we'd lost this seat, 112 votes, and we'd lost it. And I ignored completely the fact that the whole of Britain had gone over to Labour. That didn't seem to matter tuppence, as we'd lost Merionethshire, but there we are. That was my start. But there were a lot of very interesting experiences. For example, I went to one meeting. We'd managed to persuade Nicholas Glais to come along and speak for us, communist as he was then, I think, but he was going to speak for the Labour candidate. And he came along to the meeting in Llanrothin, where there were about 30 farmers turned up. And Nicholas Glais was late, as always, political meetings being what they are, and I had to speak, and I spoke, and I sweated, and there wasn't a flicker of interest from any of these farmers. It was the hardest half-hour's talk I'd ever given, until Nicholas Glais came, and within 2 minutes he put the place alive.
Right.
So I learned a lesson there.
So what did you do in the 50s then?
Well, in the 50s I went back to the college to do my honours degree in chemistry, but my father had been a coal miner, had been a big Labour Party man. I'd been brought up on the nationalisation of the mines, the Sankey Commission report and all the rest of it. So in 47, when the pits were nationalised, I, as the young son of a miner and a socialist myself, had to take part in this great socialist experiment, and I stopped being a chemist and I started to work on the haulage, Gresham Colliery. I was a haulage worker for about 6 or 7 months, and then I, as we say, went on the coal. I became a collier. I was shoveling coal for about a year and a half. I used to boast I was the only coal miner in Britain with a degree. And then the coal board brought out a scholarship scheme to train mining engineers, and I applied for one, and obviously, already being a graduate, I got a scholarship, and I did another degree in mining engineering at Nottingham University. So that was the early 50s, and I came back and went as colliery manager. Well, I came back and I went on the staff. I was overman, deputy overman, under manager, and then I became a manager at 37 years of age. And then life really became interesting, because I was not an engineer, but I think I was a manager. And there were so many things wrong in the way the coal board managed its pits, generally speaking, the old-fashioned, traditional, hard, practical, hard-swearing type of disastrous. And I decided to try and change that as far as my pit was concerned, and I did do an awful lot of things that were quite contrary to convention and the accepted wisdom, and I got into a lot of trouble. But
people tell me that you kept a colliery alive that should have been many years long gone.
Yeah, I didn't do it. I like to think that people at Bersham Colliery did it, because what actually I tried to do when I went to Bersham was managed, as all collieries had been managed and were being managed then, very much in a sort of up and down kind of way, mechanical. The manager would give instructions and everybody had to do exactly what they were told. Well, I tried to make it a sort of an industrial democracy. And I used to say, well, use your own judgment in certain circumstances. And for the first 3 or 4 years, it was turmoil. Nobody quite knew what to do, but gradually, everybody got the hang of things and became a very happy company of people. And we felt it was Bersham Colliery versus the rest, and we did do very well. And I like to think we should have been the first to close. It was an old colliery. It was wet, it was gassy, it was faulted, bad roof, everything was wrong with it, and yet it was the last to close in the Wrexham area.
You must have come across a lot of characters.
Oh, so many, and so many funny things to say. The trouble is, so many of them are not repeatable, certainly not on a public programme, but there were a lot of characters, I mean, and the wit and all the rest of it, and the personalities. Some of my bosses, I had more trouble, oddly enough, with the union in London and with the National Coal Board in London than I did at all with the work people and the staff at the colliery. One of the early things I tried to do was to alter the system of paying wages. Wages were paid in the pits in those days. Half the work people were on piece rate, so-called piece rate. If you double your output, you get double the wage. That was the theory. Well, in practice, of course, outputs did fluctuate enormously in collieries, and you could hardly halve a man's wage this week or double it the next week. So what had happened over the years, a sort of dampening coefficient had been built in. People would increase the output by so much, but the wage went up by a little bit less. And similarly, if the output went down, the wage went down a little bit less. And this dampening factor, in the end, had become totally conceptual. It was a sort of what the deputy, the foreman, and the charge hand could agree amongst themselves, and the tendency was for the one with the biggest mouth to get the most money. You know, the workman, the chargeman with the biggest mouth. Well, I decided to scrap that system, and I introduced a completely new system of payment based on work study. Luckily, I had some very good trade union representatives at the pit who saw sense and who were strong-minded, and we pushed it through, and it worked well. And after we'd had it going and working for about 6 months, the divisional chairman, one of these old-fashioned people, came along and asked what we were doing, and I explained it all, and I was so proud of it, and he immediately blew his top off and told me that I'd have to stop. And I asked him why, and he said, that's not the way we do it. And I said, well, it is the way we do it. And he sacked me. I went home on the Friday to tell my wife I just had the sack. But I went back to work on Saturday morning, and nothing was said, so we carried on. But the odd thing was, 2 or 3 years afterwards, or more than that, 5 or 6 years afterwards, the National Coal Board, on a British basis, decided to introduce a system of payment that was based on what we had done at Bersham. Yes. And we had to send all the papers and all the rest of it, and the working papers, to explain what we were doing.
How about the trade union characters in the mine?
Oh, on the whole, my experience was they were first-class people, certainly at pit level. The one at Bersham, Jimmy Yanto, his name is, he was a young chap. As a matter of fact, he became Lord Secretary on the day I became colliery manager. We were both in our early 30s.
When was that? What year was that?
That would be 1957.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So you were colliery manager until you became Member of Parliament?
Until 1970.
That's quite unique. A Labour Member of Parliament as a colliery manager.
And we used to have a Bersham Colliery Labour rally every year. I was surprised that the Conservative Party didn't object, but nobody did object. But we ran a rally on a Saturday in the summer, and we used to march with a band and get public speakers. I had Di Francis came up, for example, and Will Painter came up, and different people. Jim Griffiths came to speak for me, former Secretary of State for Wales. We used to have this great Bersham Colliery Labour rally, and nobody objected. There we are.
Got some interesting stories on some of these miners?
Yeah, but they're not repeatable. Well,
you can't say the one about the strike.
Oh well, well, he was a character. He was he was one of the few people from the Wrexham area who was not particularly fluent in English, as it happens. I mean, now everybody speaks English, but Richard, most of the work was done at Bersham in Welsh, of course, and Richard was much more fluent in Welsh than he was in English, but there were a few English-speaking people there, and on one occasion, some of the boys, we called them boys on the haulage, although some of them were adults, of course. They wanted to go on strike, and Richard, who was very much for carrying on working and so on, he called a meeting in the open air, and he said, "I tell you what, lads," he said, "I'll throw my cap in the air, and if it doesn't come down, we'll all go on strike." And he threw it up, and blow me, it got stuck in the branches of a tree, and they all went on strike. But Richard was, he was a real character. He lived at Ross, and in 1941, I think it was, Ross was bombed. One of the first places in Britain, actually, to be bombed by chance. The mountain around Ross, all heather in August, was bone dry, and it all went on fire. And the airplane must have dropped some fire bombs and caught fire. And the following night, the German airmen must have thought they'd got something, and they plastered the mountain with bombs. But a few fell on Ross, about 3 or 4. And Richard Pritchard didn't go to work the next day, but the day afterwards he turned up to work. And the manager, a chap called Horton, very blunt Yorkshireman, saw him going and said, "Where were you yesterday, Pritchard?" And Richard Pritchard said, "Don't you know, man," he said, "Ross had the biggest concentration of bombing known to history yesterday."
Yeah. You're proud of Ross?
Yeah,
all the years I've known you, you keep on coming back.
Not so much proud, because I'm proud of it, but I mean, it is Ross is to Wales as Wigan is to England. People do make fun of the place, and we like to think that it's because they're all jealous of us, you see.
But you write the stories about Ross, and what about the one with the clock?
Well, that was a very true. That tells you something about the warm-heartedness of the place. I mean, as I said, we were bombed. One of the first places in Britain to be bombed. And of course the following morning, when we all sort of gathered our wits about us, the big question was, well, why bomb Ross? We realised that the question was rather, how did he find Ross? We knew that he wanted to bomb Ross because
he knew of Ross.
He knew of Ross, and of course there was all these people. There was Alderman, William Parry, and J.T. Edwards, and John Owen Jones, Musback, and the Reverend Wirral Lewis, all big people, you see, so we knew that Hitler
knew of Ross.
Yeah. But we couldn't make out how he found the place, how the pilots found it. Until somebody said, well, it's the clock on the Stute, of course. It's not only got 4 big white faces pointing north, south, east and west, and a big golden dome, but it strikes every quarter of an hour as well, so if you couldn't see it, you'd hear it. So there was a big deputation to see the committee of the Institute, and it was decided by the committee that they'd paint the clock all black, the dome and the faces, and they would stop it striking.
And that's how it stayed.
That's perfectly true for the rest of the war. Nobody could tell the time in Ross. And indeed, the only man that did anything was Tommy Lloyd, the watchmaker and jeweller for the village. He made a fortune selling watches.
Right.
But that's gospel truth, that. For the duration of the war, the whole thing was...
You mentioned the Institute. Or Stute, as you called it. Wasn't there some story about your father going to Russia?
Yeah, that tells you about Ross, I think, more than anything. My father and his friend had gone to Ross, Tommy Rogers, had gone to Moscow. They'd always wanted to see the May Day Parade, and when they'd retired, they went to see the May Day Parade. And when they came back, I was asking them all about their experience in Russia. And Tommy Rogers was telling me about it. Wonderful place, Russia. He was going to tell the people of Ross all about Russia. They'd been misled, Ross people, about Russia. Wonderful place. So I asked him, had you seen the Kremlin? Oh, yes, saw the Kremlin, all right. Is it a big place? Big, he said. It's bigger than the Institute. Now that tells you about Ross. It's the sort of confidence of the place. Everything had to be measured by Ross standards. Tremendous self-confidence, but self-confidence goes along with innocence. Dini Weidrwydd, as we say in Welsh. And there was a classic example of the two, the innocence and the self-confidence going hand in glove.
No, better. Now you would become a candidate and a member of Parliament, and you followed James Idwell.
James Idwell,
and then of course he had an equally famous, or if more well-known, brother
Thomas William Lord Maylord, the
Lord
late
Maylord,
Lord,
yes.
Well, T.W. Thomas William. Everybody in Ross called him, of course, Thomas William. He was a character, absolute character. There's scores of stories about him. There was one classic story. It so happened at one period there were 5 MPs who lived in the Wrexham area. There was James Idwell Jones, T.W. Jones, both lived in Rhos. Will Edwards lived in Monera. Ellis Morgan lived in Wrexham. And Walter Monslow lived in Rosterson. All from the Wrexham area. And they were all coming home. And Lewis Carter Jones, 6. Lewis Carter Jones lived in Wrexham. And they were coming home one Thursday night. There was no 3-line whip apparently the Thursday night. They were all coming home on the late train. And halfway home, one of them said, let's go and have a cup of tea. So they went along to the buffet on the train. And it so happened the guard's van, for some reason, was sort of midway along the train. And they had to go along down this guard's van with a sort of wire netting on one side of the corridor. And behind the wire netting was this big Alsatian dog. And apparently Lewis Carter was very frightened of dogs, and he sort of edged along past, and coming right behind him was Ellis, who went I mean, and apparently with a very, very true noise of Alsatian dogs. You know, Lewis blew up in the air and had a terrible row with Ellis and so on. And anyway, that was that. And the train got to Wrexham and they all went home. And Ellis tells the story. He'd gone to bed, it was about midnight, he'd gone to bed and he'd just sat up in bed, and the phone at the side of the bed went. And there he was in bed and his wife there. And it was T.W. who'd got home and said, Ellis, let Flossie was his wife of course, let Flossie hear you making that noise with the dog. And Ellis said, there was I in bed with a phone and my wife at the side going, and he said, my wife thought I'd gone round to bed.
Yeah. How about the one about T.W. in going to Israel?
Oh, there's scores of stories. I think the beauty was, this was a public lecture he gave. I went along with my wife. It was advertised, the Middle East by Lord Mayor, and I thought it would have been a political lecture all about the Palestinian PLO and Yasser Arafat and all the rest of it. But it wasn't that. T.W. had been on a visit to Israel, and the lecture was a sort of cook's tour of where he'd been and what he'd done and all the rest of it. And there were a lot of exhibits on the desk in front of him. And he said on the first day we paid a visit to the River Jordan. He said, that wonderful river we were all taught about in Sunday school. And they're friends, he said, and he picked up a bottle of water. There is a bottle of water from the River Jordan. And put it down. And then he carried on and said, the next day we went to see the rock that Moses struck, and the water gushed out of the rock. And there, friends, is a piece of the rock. And so it went on every day until the last day. He said, on the last day we paid a visit to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built on the very spot where our dear Lord was buried. And there, friends, he said, is a tile from the floor of the church.
Now, let's look down. Just leave it at that. You were fortunate in one respect that whereas many people can only read of some of the senior, well-known Welsh political figures, you actually probably have heard them. You must have heard Ivan Bevan, you must have heard Jim Griffiths. I don't know what you can recall of Lloyd George. Did you ever hear Lloyd George?
No, I've never heard Lloyd George, except I've got him on tape. I've got about 10 minutes of Lloyd George on tape, which I had, the BBC very kindly gave me many years ago. But I've heard Bevan. I heard him 5 times, and I heard Jim Griffiths. The first time I heard Jim Griffiths was an eye-opener to me. This was in 45. I was in Penrhyn Deirdreth, and we'd organised a public meeting at Portmaddock, and Jim Griffiths was to speak there. And there was quite a crowded hall. There must have been 300 or 400 people there. And we'd got 1 or 2 speakers to hold the fort until Jim came. And unfortunately, they were not very good speakers, and Jim was very late, and the audience had really got restive and booing and all the rest of it, when in marched Jim Griffiths at last. And it was an eye-opener. I've never seen anything like it. Here was this hostile by now audience, and then came Jim and he started. Lovely Carmarthenshire voice, beautiful voice, and cracked a joke, passing aside, and you had to smile and laugh. And within 3 minutes, he'd got the whole audience absolutely eating out of his hand. It really was the most incredible. I'd heard about Bevan. I hadn't actually heard Bevan speak then, but I'd heard about him as a brilliant speaker, but I thought, well, he must be brilliant if he's any better than Jim Griffiths.
And you heard Bevan
But
afterwards?
I did hear Bevan, yes. I heard him on 5 occasions. Never, of course, in the House of Commons, but I heard him on the platform. He came to Corwin on one occasion, and Corwin Pavilion must have held, there must have been 3,500 people present. And it was an experience to be lived through. I can't remember what he said now, but it really was. I remember vividly the impression he created.
Mentioning Bevan, before I'm going to ask you one other question, mentioning Bevan, of course, there is his classic story on Jenkins, isn't there?
Well, that's right, yeah, about Roy Jenkins, about the allegation. I suppose it's true, I don't know. Roy Jenkins had made his maiden speech the previous day, and that next morning, Bevan and a few others, Yori Thomas and so on, were sat around the Welsh table in the tea room, all having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And one said to the other, I see Arthur's lad, that's Arthur Jenkins, of course. See, Arthur's lad made his maiden speech last night. Yeah, good speech. That lad's going to go far. This was for Roy Jenkins, of course. And then the other friend said, no, he won't go far. He's too lazy. At which Bevan, with his bit of a stammer, said, lazy, he said? Anybody from Abersychan who speaks like that can't be lazy.
Yeah. Well, one final thing, Tom. How do you compare those politicians, that style of politician, with today? You know, there seems to be something major missing in the modern politician. Or are we being... Both of us are getting older, or are we being critical? Because I also heard Bevan when I was a candidate in Carmarthen when Jim was still an MP in Llanelli. Have we...
I think we're deluding ourselves, yes. I mean, I've never been a great admirer of Bevan, other than as an orator. I mean, obviously he was a brilliant orator. I never cared much for his politics, or for his personality insofar as he was a very vain man. And not to me, anyway, the right sort of man to worship anyway. But coming back simply to the question of oratory, I've got Lloyd George on tape, and undoubtedly Lloyd George must have been in his day an incredible orator. He comes across very floridly and verbose. He doesn't strike me. His voice, to start with, is not a very good voice. It's a very light voice, and as I say, it's very florid and verbose, and I'm sure Gladstone would have been even worse, simply as orators, and Bevan now in his day. Nowadays, oratory is a different style, and I would have said Jenkins, at his best, the power of the argument rather than the rhetoric was the main weapon in Jenkins's oratory, and appeals much better, I would have said today, to people who are much more questioning and much more sceptical.
The nearest probably that we might have experienced was Michael Foot in the 70s.
That's right. Michael, at his best, was exceptionally good, but unfortunately he did become, I think, a bit of a caricature of himself towards the end. Just like Kinnock seemed to do exactly the same sort of thing. He hadn't got the sparkle, the originality that Bevan had, from what I can recall.
Do you know of any rule bill in the 50s? Were you involved with that?
No, I had nothing
to do with that.
No. This was when Jim Griffiths and
that's it, and S.O. Davis and
it was S.O.'s bill, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, that's it.
No, I had nothing to do with it.
Do you remember the S.O. Davis when he stood against the Labour Party in Merthyr?
I do. Yeah.
Both of us were there then, and how the Parliamentary Labour Party ostracised.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah.
All the Welsh Labour MPs ignored S.O. Davis.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was quite shocked. I mean, I know S.O. had stood against the official Labour Party candidate, but I don't know what the internal politics in Merthyr Tydfil were at the time. Why they should have sacked S.O. I don't know. I don't know the merits of the case. But there we are. He stood against the official. But he was the standing member, or the sitting member, as it were. And I felt then that this was a shocking example of bad habits of the Labour Party. I'll give you another good example which shocked me, rigid. I went into Parliament in 70, and the same year Anthony Meyer went as MP for North West Clwyd, I think it was then. he'd been an MP for Slough previously, but lost his seat. Then he came now, he was a new member. So he was a member for a Welsh constituency, but a Conservative. But a very independent Conservative, as we now know, and with his standing against Margaret Thatcher. But he struck me as being a decent sort of fellow. Anyway, he lived in a house not far from Westminster, from the House of Commons. And they had a party, and he invited all the Labour MPs to the party. And of course I went without thinking. And I always remember the following morning, Leo Absey pitching into me how disgraceful it was that I had accepted an invitation of a Tory MP, and I just couldn't get over this. The sheer lack of self-confidence and so on was, perhaps it's this question of Leo Absey didn't come from Ross. If he'd have come from Ross, he would have had a lot more self-confidence, perhaps. But I always remember Leo being very bitterly critical of the fact that I'd dared to accept an invitation from a Tory. I thought, dear me, we were in a bad way. I hadn't realised the South Wales people were quite like that.
Oh, well, some of them are. Anyway, Tom, look, that's a sample that we can make available for others to consider what a better prepared job can be done. This is totally off the cuff. It's taken us 20 minutes, totally unprepared, and we'll see what we can develop further.
Have you got him